If there is to be reform in the United Nations or reform anywhere in the world, it is by the words and the courage of people such as her. And Claudia, I just have to ask one question, and it is, how many trees did the green conscious UN have to cut down to produce these circulars?
That's just today.
That's just today's, okay. Words that should haunt the halls of the United Nations were spoken by a Soviet dissident during the height of the Cold War, who warned, "If you but blink, we will disappear." And from the perspective of the minorities in the Middle East, the UN has not only blinked, but distracted by the obsessive focus on Israel, closed its eyes, and they are disappearing. In 1900, Christians constituted over 20% of the population of the Middle East. Today, it is less than 2%. While the Muslim population in Europe, North and South America, and Australia have increased significantly and rapidly, Christians in the Middle East have experienced negative population growth. The only country where there has been a positive growth rate is Israel. Midway through the last century, Christians comprised 80% of the population of Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. They now constitute less than 15%. Mosques exceed churches 15 to 10. And it's estimated that nearly 2/3 of the Christian population fled during the time that Jordan occupied the West Bank. And under the Palestinian Authority, the approximately 50,000 remaining Christians are only about 2.4% of the population. In Israel, Christians numbered 34,000 in 1948. Today, there are over 146,000, and the population, that number is expected to rise to 163,000 over the next 2 years, reflecting an almost 2% growth rate. For over 5 years, Christians in Bethlehem put up with acts of violence and extortion, land seizures by Fatah-related militias, the Tanzim Fatah and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. The Palestinian Authority failed miserably or purposefully to exert security measures to protect the Christian businesses and property. And in 2006, Hamas took the majority of municipal council seats in Bethlehem, partly in reaction to the corruption of the Palestinian security services and Fatah, and conditions have worsened. Today, under Hamas, Gaza City, Christian church leaders are intimidated and coerced into sitting through speeches that call for Islamic hegemony. Last month, the owner of a Christian library, Rami Qadr Ayad, was murdered, leaving behind a 2-year-old son, a 10-month-old, and his wife who was 6 months pregnant. And recently, Hamas authorities informed the Bible Society they couldn't guarantee the safety of the Bible Society's staff. And so but one of the families have now fled to the West Bank. Has the UN taken up the cause of the indigenous Christian minority that is being diminished under Palestinian occupation? It blinks. Egypt, who has now been elected to the UN Human Rights Council, joining such stellar human rights icons as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, is in the midst of a concerted effort to destroy a Coptic rights advocacy organization. In August, 2 members of the Canadian-based Middle East Christians Association were arrested. It so happens that the organization had just filed a suit against members of the Egyptian government, including President Mubarak, seeking damages for the victims who survived the Al-Qush massacre in 2000. 22 Coptic Christians were murdered. The perpetrators, all Muslim extremists, were released. The 2 Mecca representatives were released on November 4th after 90 days of interrogation without being charged. And less than a week later, the other 2 members of the organization were arrested, along with its attorney from Alexandria. They are all 3 being held in the Torah prison today. 2 young cops were murdered on October 3rd in Awlad Tak Garb in Egypt. Copts in Egypt are marginalized, discriminated against, and made vulnerable by the nearly unrestricted use of the government-controlled media by Islamic extremists who demonize and humiliate the minorities. Copts are indigenous to Egypt, once the majority, but now they number between 10 and 15% of the population. Nevertheless, it's the largest Christian population in the Middle East. Has the UN taken up the cause of the indigenous Coptic minority that is being diminished by an increasingly nervous Egyptian government and an increasingly confident Muslim Brotherhood? No, again, the UN blinks. In Iraq, the Chaldean Archbishop Louis Sacco laments that in Iraq Christians are dying, the church is disappearing under continued persecution threats and violence that are carried out by extremists who leave no choice except conversion or exile. 20 years ago, the Christian population of Iraq was 1.4 million. In 2003, when Saddam was overthrown, it was 1 million. And since the war, Christians now number less than 700,000. In one neighborhood of Baghdad alone, Dora neighborhood, once there was 20,000 Christian families living there in 2003. Today there are less than 3,000 families, and few of those are intact. At least 25% of the Christian population has fled outside of the country, and that's the conservative estimate. Some report that as high as 50% have fled. And in UNHCR reports that 38% of those refugees who have fled to Syria are in fact Christian, a disproportionate amount considering that the population, the Christian population of Iraq was 4 to 5%. In Jordan, there are approximately 700,000 Christians in temporary asylum. Lebanon, 15,000 to 25,000. In other words, there is a religious cleansing which is taking place as Muslim extremists, either from Al-Qaeda or from the Shiites, demand that Christians convert to Islam, or send daughters and sisters to convert to marry a Muslim man, or force families to leave or be killed. The Iraqi government drags its feet at following and allowing an administrative area in the Nineveh Plains, which is the ancestral homeland of the Assyrians who are indigenous to Iraq. The only militia to have laid down its arms in obedience to the coalition's request at the beginning of the war were the Christian militias. And so now they sit the most vulnerable populations in Iraq because they were trying to do the right thing. And yet the Iraqi government and the coalition forces do not train local police forces to provide security for the minorities. The only people who allowed guns are the extremists preying upon the vulnerable minorities. And sometimes people say, well, you're an alarmist about the population of Christians being exterminated from Iraq. But I think back in the 1920s, when the Jewish population of Iraq was 20%, and today there are less than 15 individuals who are at this time packing their bags to go to Holland. It can happen. I just returned from the Middle East meeting with Christian Iraqi refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. Syria withdrew our delegation's visas shortly before the mission, so we weren't able to go there. But many argue that the violence that are faced by the Christians is equal to that which the Shiites and the Sunnis have suffered. In fact, I just met Jim Moran downstairs. He's going to meet with the Iraqi government. We had this discussion. And he said, no, the Christians are just as bad. I mean, their situation is no worse than that of the Sunnis. So why should they deserve better treatment? When you reach a wall like that, it is difficult to argue. You know, if you're not open to the situation that there are minorities within a minority and that they are very vulnerable, it's very difficult to work with the U.S. House of Representatives or the Senate or the administration to gain anything positive. And this is unfortunate because the minorities are truly the force of moderation and the clearest allies to the aspirations of creating a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, democratic society, free society in Iraq.